The waves crashed against the rocky shore of the remote coastline as Dr. Sarah Chen adjusted her medical bag one final time. She had volunteered for this humanitarian mission to provide medical care to coastal villages, but nothing could have prepared her for what she was about to witness. The morning sun painted the water in shades of gold and crimson, creating a deceptively peaceful scene that would soon be shattered. Sarah had been walking along the beach, collecting shells and enjoying the quiet before her scheduled visit to the nearby fishing village, when she heard the distant rumble of helicopters. At first, she thought it might be a rescue operation, or perhaps military training exercises that were common in this region. But as the sound grew louder and more urgent, she realized something was terribly wrong. The helicopters appeared on the horizon like angry wasps, their rotors cutting through the morning air with mechanical precision. Sarah could see they were military aircraft, painted in dark colors that seemed to absorb the sunlight. Her heart began to race as she counted not one, not two, but 3 helicopters approaching the coastline at high speed. Something big was happening, and she found herself directly in the path of whatever operation was unfolding. As a civilian doctor, Sarah knew she should probably move away from the area, find cover and wait for whatever was happening to pass. But her medical training had taught her that where there were military operations, there were often casualties. Her oath as a physician compelled her to stay, to be ready to help anyone who might need medical attention. She had no idea that this decision would change
not only her life but also touch the hearts of some
of the most hardened warriors in the world. The first helicopter touched, down about 50 yards from where Sarah stood, sending sand and debris flying in all directions. She shielded her eyes and watched as figures began emerging from the aircraft. Even from a distance, she could tell these were not ordinary soldiers. They moved with a fluid precision that spoke of elite training. Their gear was top of the line and their coordination was flawless. These were Navy SEALs, though Sarah didn't know it yet. The second helicopter landed nearby, disgorging more personnel who immediately began setting up what appeared to be a temporary command post. Sarah counted at least 12 men, all dressed in combat gear, all moving with the same deadly efficiency. But something was wrong with their formation. As they organized themselves on the beach, she noticed that several of the men were supporting others, and there was an urgency to their movements that suggested injuries. The third helicopter was the last to land, and as it touched down, Sarah could see why. Through the open door, she glimpsed someone lying on a stretcher, other figures hunched over the prone form. The helicopter's medic was gesturing frantically, and even from her distance, Sarah could sense the desperation in his movements. Someone was badly hurt, possibly dying, and they needed immediate medical attention. Without thinking, Sarah began walking toward the helicopters. Her medical bag bounced against her hip as she quickened her pace, her training overriding any fear or common sense that might have told her to stay away. She had seen enough battlefield injuries during her residency at a trauma center to recognize the signs of a medical emergency, and every instinct she possessed was screaming at her to help. As she approached the nearest group of SEALs, she noticed something that would stick with her for the rest of her life. These men, who were clearly elite warriors, were standing in complete silence. There was no shouting, no frantic radio chatter, no urgent commands being barked out. Instead, there was a heavy, oppressive quiet that seemed to weigh down on the entire beach like a thick blanket. The silence was not the calm efficiency of professionals at work. It was something deeper, more profound. It was the silence of men who had seen too much, done too much, and were now facing something that had shaken them to their core. Sarah had never experienced anything like it, and she found herself slowing her approach, suddenly unsure of herself. One of the SEALs noticed her coming and turned to face her. Even through his tactical gear and face paint, she could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight of whatever mission they had just completed. He held up a hand, clearly intending to stop her from coming any closer, but Sarah pressed on. She was a doctor, and someone needed help. The SEAL who had noticed her approach tapped the shoulder of what appeared to be the team leader. The leader turned, and Sarah found herself looking into the most haunted eyes she had ever seen. This was a man who had witnessed horrors that most people couldn't imagine. But there was something about his current expression that suggested whatever had happened on their latest mission had affected even him. Sarah stopped about 10 feet away from the group and called out in a clear, professional voice that she hoped would carry over the sound of the helicopter rotors that were still winding down. She identified herself as a doctor and offered her assistance with their wounded. The response she received was unlike anything she had expected from a group of elite soldiers. Instead of the quick acceptance or polite dismissal she had anticipated, the SEALs simply stared at her. Not with suspicion or hostility, but with something that looked almost like recognition mixed with disbelief. The team leader exchanged glances with several of his men, and Sarah could see some kind of silent communication passing between them. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. The only sounds were the crashing of waves against the shore, the distant cry of seabirds, and the gradually slowing whir of helicopter rotors. Sarah felt as if she had stumbled into some kind of sacred space, a moment that was not meant for civilian eyes. Finally, the team leader stepped forward, and Sarah could see that he was struggling with some internal decision. His mouth opened as if he were about to speak, then closed again. Behind him, the other SEALs continued to watch her with that same strange mixture of recognition and amazement. The team leader, a weathered man with steel-gray eyes, finally found his voice. His name was Commander Jake Morrison, though Sarah wouldn't learn this until much later. When he spoke, his words were measured and careful, as if he were testing each one before allowing it to leave his lips. He asked Sarah to confirm that she was indeed a medical doctor, and inquired about her experience with trauma cases. Sarah quickly rattled off her credentials, her years of emergency room experience, and her current volunteer work with medical missions. As she spoke, she noticed more of the SEALs gathering around, drawn by the conversation but maintaining their strange, reverent silence. Behind them, she could see the medic from the 3rd helicopter frantically working over the wounded man on the stretcher. Commander Morrison nodded slowly, then made a decision that would change everything. He stepped aside and gestured toward the wounded SEAL, his voice barely above a whisper as he asked Sarah to take a look. As she approached the stretcher, Sarah's medical training kicked into high gear, pushing aside any nervousness or confusion about the situation. The wounded man was unconscious, his face pale beneath streaks of camouflage paint and dried blood. Sarah could immediately see multiple injuries, a deep gash across his forehead, what appeared to be shrapnel wounds on his arms and chest, and signs of significant blood loss. But it was his dog tags that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. Among the standard military identification, there was something else hanging from the chain around his neck. A small worn photograph protected by a clear plastic sleeve. The image showed a young woman in civilian clothes, smiling at the camera with bright, intelligent eyes. The woman looked remarkably similar to Sarah herself. Same dark hair, same facial structure, same warm smile. Sarah stared at the photograph for a long moment, confusion washing over her. The resemblance was uncanny, almost impossible to explain as mere coincidence. She looked up at the team medic, a young man whose hands were shaking slightly as he continued to work on the wounded SEAL's injuries. When their eyes met, the medic's expression confirmed what Sarah was beginning to suspect. There was something very significant about this wounded warrior. The medic, whose name was Corpsman Danny Rodriguez, had been trying to stabilize the wounded SEAL for the past 20 minutes with limited success. His medical training was extensive, but the injuries were severe, and they were operating without the sophisticated equipment of a field hospital. When he saw Sarah approaching with her medical bag, hope flickered in his eyes for the first time since the mission had gone wrong. Sarah immediately began her assessment, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she checked vital signs and examined wounds. The wounded SEAL's pulse was weak but steady, his breathing shallow but regular. The head wound was serious but not immediately life-threatening, and the shrapnel wounds, while painful and bloody, had missed major organs and arteries. As Sarah worked, she became aware of the absolute silence that had fallen over the entire beach. The other SEALs had formed a loose circle around the stretcher, but none of them spoke. They simply watched with an intensity that was almost palpable. Sarah had never experienced anything like it in all her years of medical practice. Even in the most serious trauma situations, there was usually some level of communication, some background noise, some sign of normal human activity. But here, on this remote beach with these elite warriors, there was only silence. It was as if the entire world had stopped to observe what was happening on that stretcher. Sarah found herself working more carefully, more deliberately, aware that every move she made was being scrutinized by men who understood better than most the difference between life and death. As she cleaned and began to suture the head wound, Sarah noticed something else about the wounded SEAL. His facial features, visible now that she had cleaned away some of the blood and dirt, bore a striking resemblance to her own. The same strong jawline, the same nose, the same general bone structure that she saw every morning in the mirror. The resemblance, combined with the photograph, was creating a puzzle that Sarah couldn't quite solve. Who was this man, and why did he carry a picture of someone who looked so much like her? Why were these hardened warriors treating the situation with such reverence? And most importantly, why did she feel such a strong, inexplicable connection to this wounded stranger? Commander Morrison had positioned himself where he could watch both Sarah's work and her reactions. He had served with the wounded SEAL, whose name was Lieutenant Michael Chen, for over 3 years. He knew about the photograph, knew about the story behind it, and knew why Michael carried it with him on every mission. What he hadn't expected was to encounter someone who looked so remarkably like the woman in the picture, especially not here in this remote location, at this particular moment. The other SEALs were having similar thoughts. They had all heard Michael's story, had all seen him look at that photograph before dangerous missions, had all witnessed the way he drew strength from whatever memory it represented. To see someone who could have been that woman's twin sister appear at this exact moment, offering medical help when their teammate needed it most, felt like something beyond coincidence. Sarah continued her work, using techniques she had learned in trauma surgery to control bleeding and stabilize injuries. She had the wounded SEAL's condition improving within minutes, his vital signs strengthening, his color beginning to return. But with each passing moment, her curiosity about the photograph and the resemblance grew stronger. Finally, unable to contain her questions any longer, Sarah looked up at Commander Morrison and asked about the photograph. The commander's expression grew even more serious, if that were possible, and he glanced around at his men before speaking. What he told her would begin to unravel a mystery that had haunted Lieutenant Michael Chen for most of his adult life. The woman in the photograph, Commander Morrison explained in quiet tones, was Michael's sister. She had been missing for over 15 years, disappeared without a trace when she was just 18 years old. Michael had never stopped looking for her, had never given up hope that someday, somehow, he would find her again. He carried her picture as a reminder of what he was fighting for, what he hoped to return to someday. Sarah felt the world shift slightly as the implications of this revelation sank in. The resemblance wasn't just coincidence, it couldn't be. The facial features, the eyes, the smile in the photograph that matched her own so perfectly. As she looked down at the unconscious man on the stretcher, Sarah began to wonder if she had just encountered the brother she never knew she had. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she continued treating the wounded SEAL's injuries, her mind racing with possibilities that seemed impossible, yet undeniable. She had been adopted as a baby, had always known she had biological family somewhere in the world, but had never actively searched for them. Her adoptive parents had given her a wonderful life, and she had been content to let the past remain in the past. But now, staring at the photograph of a woman who could have been her identical twin, feeling an inexplicable connection to the unconscious man before her, Sarah found herself questioning everything she thought she knew about her origins. Commander Morrison's words echoed in her mind. A sister who had disappeared 15 years ago. A brother who had never stopped searching. The timeline matched. Sarah would have been 15 years ago, just starting college, just beginning the life that had led her to medical school and eventually to this beach. But her memories of that time were clear and uninterrupted. She had never been missing, never been lost, never been anything other than Sarah Chen, adopted daughter of loving parents who had given her every opportunity to succeed. As these thoughts swirled through her mind, Sarah noticed that Lieutenant Michael Chen was beginning to stir. His eyelids fluttered and a soft groan escaped his lips. The other SEALs immediately pressed closer, their earlier silence breaking as they murmured words of encouragement to their wounded teammate. Sarah quickly checked his pupils and vital signs, relieved to see that he was regaining consciousness without any apparent signs of serious brain injury. Michael's eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, then gradually sharpening as he became aware of his surroundings. Sarah found herself looking directly into eyes that were the same shape and color as her own, eyes that seemed to register her presence with a shock that went beyond simple confusion about where he was or what had happened to him. For a long moment, neither Sarah nor Michael spoke. They simply stared at each other, two strangers who somehow felt like they had known each other their entire lives. The other SEALs watched this exchange with growing amazement, seeing the same impossible resemblance that had struck them all when Sarah first appeared on the beach. Michael tried to sit up, wincing as the movement aggravated his injuries. Sarah gently pressed him back down, her medical training overriding the emotional turmoil she was experiencing. She explained that he had been wounded, that she was a doctor, and that he needed to remain still while she finished treating his injuries. But even as she spoke in her professional tone, she could see the recognition growing in Michael's eyes. Commander Morrison knelt beside the stretcher and quietly filled Michael in on what had happened, how they had been extracted from their mission, how Sarah had appeared on the beach and offered medical assistance, how she bore an uncanny resemblance to someone Michael knew very well. As the commander spoke, Michael's gaze never left Sarah's face, his expression cycling through disbelief, hope, and something that looked very much like wonder. Finally, Michael found his voice. It was weak from his injuries and the effects of blood loss, but clear enough for everyone to hear. He asked Sarah her name, her age, where she was from. With each answer she gave, the amazement in his eyes grew stronger. When she mentioned that she had been adopted as a baby, that her adoptive name was Sarah Chen, but she had never known her original family name, Michael's reaction was immediate and profound. Tears began streaming down the wounded SEAL's face, cutting tracks through the dirt and camouflage paint that still streaked his cheeks. He reached up with a shaking hand and touched the photograph hanging from his neck, then looked back at Sarah with an expression of such pure joy and disbelief that it took her breath away. In a voice barely above a whisper, Michael spoke a name that Sarah had never heard before, but that somehow felt familiar, felt right, felt like coming home. He called her by a nickname that only a brother would use, a name that had been silent for 15 years but had never been forgotten. The sound of it made Sarah's heart skip a beat and brought tears to her own eyes. The story that Michael told, haltingly and with frequent pauses as Sarah continued to tend to his wounds, painted a picture of a family torn apart by tragedy. Their parents had died in a car accident when Sarah was just a baby, and Michael was barely 5 years old. The children had been separated by the foster care system, placed with different families in different states. Michael had aged out of the system at 18 and had immediately begun searching for his lost sister. But the trail had gone cold. What Michael didn't know, what no one had told him, was that Sarah had been adopted by a wonderful family who had given her their name and their love, but who had also decided it would be better for her to start fresh, without the weight of her tragic past. The adoption had been handled privately, with sealed records that even a determined military professional couldn't penetrate. As Sarah listened to Michael's story, her own memories began to shift and change. She found herself remembering fragments of dreams that had seemed random, but now felt like echoes of early childhood. A boy with kind eyes who used to sing her to sleep, the sound of laughter in a kitchen filled with morning sunlight, the feeling of being safe and protected in someone's arms. The other SEALs had retreated slightly, giving the siblings space for their reunion, while still maintaining their protective circle around the stretcher. Sarah could see that many of these hardened warriors had tears in their own eyes as they witnessed the impossible unfolding before them. Commander Morrison later said it was the most beautiful and heartbreaking thing he had ever seen in 20 years of military service. Sarah finished treating Michael's wounds with hands that were steadier now, guided by a sense of purpose that went beyond professional duty. This wasn't just another patient, this was her brother, the family she had never known she was missing, the connection she had searched for without even realizing she was searching. As she worked, Michael continued to share fragments of his memories, how he had remembered her laugh, how he had never stopped believing they would find each other again, how he had joined the military partly in hopes that the resources and connections might help him locate her. He told her about the missions where he had carried her photograph for luck, about the times when thoughts of her had kept him going through the darkest moments of combat. The afternoon sun was beginning to set over the ocean, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. The military operation that had brought Michael and his team to this beach was complete, but none of them seemed in any hurry to leave. They had witnessed something that transcended their mission, something that reminded them why they fought and what they were protecting. As the golden hour light bathed the beach in warmth, Sarah found herself sitting cross-legged beside Michael's stretcher, her medical bag forgotten as they talked in quiet voices about the years that had been stolen from them. Michael was strong enough now to sit up with support, and the immediate danger from his injuries had passed, but neither sibling seemed ready to end this miraculous reunion. The other SEALs had established a loose perimeter around them, understanding without being told that this was a sacred moment that deserved protection. Commander Morrison had radioed for a medical evacuation helicopter that would transport Michael to a proper military hospital, but the aircraft wouldn't arrive for another hour. For now, brother and sister had time to begin rebuilding the connection that had been severed so long ago. Sarah shared stories of her childhood with her adoptive family, how her parents had encouraged her love of science and medicine, how she had excelled in school partly because learning felt like a way to honor the opportunities she had been given. She told Michael about her decision to become a doctor, her years of training, and her current volunteer work providing medical care to underserved communities around the world. Michael listened with rapt attention, storing away every detail like precious treasures. He told Sarah about his own journey, how he had struggled in foster care, how he had found discipline and purpose in the military, how every mission he had undertaken had been driven partly by the hope that it might somehow bring him closer to finding her. His voice grew stronger as he spoke, animated by a joy that seemed to energize him despite his injuries. The photograph that had started it all lay between them now, carefully removed from Michael's dog tags. Sarah held it gently, studying the face that looked so much like her own. Michael explained that it was the only picture of her that had survived their parents' accident, taken just weeks before the tragedy that had changed both their lives forever. Looking at the image, Sarah began to remember more fragments from her earliest years. She recalled a rocking horse in a sunny room, the smell of her mother's perfume, the sound of her father's voice reading bedtime stories. But most clearly, she remembered Michael, always protective, always kind, always making sure she felt safe and loved even when the adult world around them was falling apart. The memories came in waves, each one more vivid than the last. Sarah remembered how Michael used to make up silly songs to make her laugh when she was scared during thunderstorms. She remembered the way he would share his favorite toys with her, how he had taught her to tie her shoes, how he had promised that he would always take care of her no matter what happened. That promise, Sarah realized, was why Michael had never stopped searching. Even as a young child, he had understood that being her big brother was not just a role, but a sacred responsibility. When the system had separated them, it had broken something fundamental in his world, something he had spent 15 years trying to repair. The SEALs who were witnessing this reunion found themselves profoundly moved by what they were seeing. These were men who had faced enemy fire without flinching, who had completed missions that required them to suppress their emotions and focus solely on objectives. But watching Michael and Sarah rediscover each other, seeing the pure joy and love that radiated from both siblings, reminded them of the human connections that made their sacrifices meaningful. Corman Rodriguez, who had been the first to treat Michael's injuries, approached with news that the medical evacuation helicopter was approaching. The sound of rotors could be heard in the distance, growing steadily louder. Sarah felt a pang of panic at the thought of being separated from Michael again so soon after finding him, but he quickly reassured her. Michael had accumulated significant leave time during his years of service, time he had never taken because he had no family to visit, no home to return to. Now, he told Sarah, he finally had a reason to use that leave. As soon as he was released from the hospital, he wanted to meet her adoptive parents, to see the life she had built, to begin the process of truly becoming siblings again. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she realized that her life was about to change in ways she could never have imagined when she woke up that morning. She had started the day as a woman with no biological family, content with the loving but limited circle of her adoptive relatives. Now she was discovering that she had a brother who had never stopped loving her, never stopped hoping for this moment, never stopped believing that they would find each other again. The medical evacuation helicopter touched down nearby, and the crew quickly prepared to transfer Michael to proper medical facilities. As they lifted him onto a new stretcher, Sarah walked alongside, unwilling to let go of his hand. The helicopter crew, experienced in handling military casualties, recognized the emotional significance of the moment and worked around the siblings' connection rather than forcing them apart. Commander Morrison approached Sarah as Michael was being loaded into the helicopter. He explained that Michael was one of the finest soldiers he had ever served with, a man whose courage and dedication had saved countless lives over the years. The commander's voice carried deep respect and genuine affection as he spoke about Michael's character and service record. But more than that, Commander Morrison wanted Sarah to understand how much her presence on the beach that day had meant to all of them. In a profession where they regularly faced loss and trauma, witnessing such a profound reunion had reminded them of the power of hope and the importance of never giving up on the people we love. As the helicopter prepared for takeoff, Michael pressed something into Sarah's hand, a small military coin that bore the insignia of his SEAL team. He explained that it was given to team members who had proven themselves under fire, who had earned the absolute trust and respect of their brothers in arms. By giving it to Sarah, he was welcoming her not just back into his life but into the extended family of warriors who had become his brothers over the years. The helicopter lifted off, carrying Michael toward medical care and the beginning of his recovery. Sarah stood on the beach watching until the aircraft disappeared into the sunset, clutching the military coin and feeling overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just occurred. The remaining SEALs began preparing for their own departure, but before they left, each man approached Sarah individually. Without exception, they thanked her not just for the medical care she had provided, but for being the answer to a prayer that Michael had carried in his heart for 15 years. Several of them mentioned that they had families of their own, and that witnessing this reunion had reminded them of how precious and fragile those connections truly were. 3 days later, Sarah found herself walking through the sterile corridors of Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, her heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. She had cut her humanitarian mission short, making arrangements to return home so she could be with Michael during his recovery. The hospital staff had been accommodating when they learned about the extraordinary circumstances of the siblings' reunion. Michael's room was in the surgical wing, and as Sarah approached his door, she could hear voices inside. Several male voices speaking in the casual, joking tone that she had learned was common among military personnel. She knocked softly and entered to find Michael surrounded by members of his SEAL team, all of whom had taken time from their leave to visit their wounded teammate. The transformation in Michael's appearance was remarkable. The dirt and camouflage paint had been cleaned away, revealing features that were even more clearly similar to Sarah's own. His wounds were properly bandaged, and though he was still pale from blood loss, his eyes were bright and alert. When he saw Sarah in the doorway, his face lit up with a smile that made her heart skip a beat. The SEALs greeted Sarah like an old friend, and she realized that word of the reunion had spread throughout the team. Commander Morrison stood up and offered her his chair, but she declined, preferring to sit on the edge of Michael's bed where she could be close to her newly found brother. The easy acceptance she felt from these elite warriors touched her deeply. Over the next several hours, Sarah listened as Michael and his teammates shared stories from their years of service together. She began to understand the depth of the bonds that existed between these men, connections forged in extreme circumstances that had created a brotherhood stronger than blood. What amazed her most was how naturally they had extended that brotherhood to include her. Corman Rodriguez, who had been present during the beach reunion, had apparently told everyone about Sarah's quick thinking and professional medical skills. The SEALs spoke with genuine admiration about how she had stepped in to help without hesitation, treating Michael with expertise that had undoubtedly prevented his injuries from becoming more serious. As the day wore on and visiting hours ended, the other SEALs gradually departed, but not before each one had personally thanked Sarah again and extended invitations for her to attend various team events and gatherings. Commander Morrison was the last to leave, and he pulled Sarah aside for a private conversation. The commander explained that Michael's story had become something of a legend within their unit. His unwavering determination to find his lost sister, his carrying of her photograph on dangerous missions, his refusal to give up hope despite years of disappointment. All of this had inspired his teammates and had become a symbol of the kind of loyalty and perseverance that defined their brotherhood. Commander Morrison also shared something that Michael had been too modest to mention himself. On the mission that had led to his injuries, Michael had single-handedly saved the lives of 3 other SEALs when their position came under enemy fire. His wounds had been sustained while providing covering fire that allowed his teammates to reach safety. The commander's voice carried deep emotion as he explained that Michael's actions exemplified the selfless courage that made him such an exceptional soldier. After the commander left, Sarah and Michael were finally alone together for the first time since the beach. The hospital room felt peaceful and quiet, a stark contrast to the dramatic circumstances of their reunion. Sarah pulled her chair closer to Michael's bed, and they began the deeper conversation that had been interrupted by medical emergencies and well-meaning visitors. Michael wanted to know everything about Sarah's life, her childhood memories, her educational journey, her relationships, her dreams and aspirations. He listened with intense focus as she described growing up with her adoptive parents, two kind and loving people who had given her every opportunity to succeed. Sarah was careful to emphasize how grateful she was for the life they had provided, not wanting Michael to feel that their separation had been entirely tragic. In return, Sarah learned about Michael's more difficult path through the foster care system. He had been placed with several different families over the years, some good and some less so, but none had been able to provide the permanent home and stability that he had craved. The military had given him the structure and belonging that he had been searching for, but it had never filled the void left by losing his little sister. Michael showed Sarah a small notebook that he had kept throughout his adult life, filled with details about his search for her. Pages and pages of information. Adoption agencies he had contacted, databases he had searched, private investigators he had hired with his military pay. The dedication and thoroughness of his efforts moved Sarah to tears. He had never given up, never stopped believing that someday they would be reunited. As they talked deep into the evening, Sarah began to understand the full magnitude of what their separation had cost both of them. For Michael, it had been 15 years of carrying a burden of responsibility and love with no outlet, of feeling incomplete despite his professional achievements and the respect of his peers. For Sarah, it had been a lifetime of vague feelings that something was missing, an unexplained emptiness that she had filled with academic and professional accomplishments, but that had never quite gone away. The next few days fell into a comfortable routine. Sarah spent her mornings at Michael's bedside, helping him with physical therapy exercises and providing the kind of emotional support that only family could offer. The afternoons were often filled with visits from other SEALs, and Sarah began to feel like she was being welcomed into an extended family that stretched far beyond just her and Michael. Dr. Patricia Williams, the physician overseeing Michael's care, was fascinated by the story of the siblings' reunion and the positive impact it was having on Michael's recovery. She had seen many wounded warriors struggle with the psychological aspects of healing, but Michael's progress was remarkable. Having Sarah present seemed to provide him with a level of motivation and optimism that was accelerating his physical recovery as well. Sarah also noticed changes in herself. The constant low-level anxiety that she had carried for as long as she could remember, a feeling she had attributed to the pressures of medical training and practice, had virtually disappeared. She felt more complete, more grounded, more at peace with herself than she ever had before. It was as if finding Michael had filled a space in her soul that she hadn't even realized was empty. One evening, as Sarah was preparing to leave the hospital for the night, Michael asked her about her future plans. She had been thinking about the same question herself. Her humanitarian work was important to her, but the idea of continuing to travel the world while Michael was recovering felt wrong. She wanted to be near him, to continue building their relationship, to make up for some of the lost time. Michael, perhaps reading her thoughts, suggested that she consider establishing her practice closer to his base of operations. There were underserved communities near every military installation, he pointed out, places where her skills and compassion could make a real difference. The idea appealed to Sarah immediately. It would allow her to continue her humanitarian mission while staying connected to the family she had just found. 2 weeks after the reunion on the beach, Sarah found herself standing in the living room of her adoptive parents' home, nervously preparing for one of the most important conversations of her life. She had called ahead to let them know she was bringing someone special to meet them, but she hadn't explained the full story. How do you tell the parents who raised you that you found the biological brother you never knew existed? Her adoptive parents, Dr. James Chen and Professor Linda Chen, had always been supportive of her choices and understanding of her need to explore her identity. They had never hidden the fact that she was adopted, and they had always encouraged her to search for her biological family if she ever felt the need. but Sarah had never expressed interest in doing so, content with the loving family she already had. The doorbell rang, and Sarah's heart jumped. She opened the door to find Michael standing there in his dress uniform, having been released from the hospital that morning. Despite still showing signs of his recent injuries, he looked every inch the decorated military officer he was. More importantly, he looked nervous, which somehow made Sarah feel better about her own anxiety. Sarah's parents greeted Michael with the same warmth they showed all of their daughter's friends, but she could see the questions in their eyes. The physical resemblance between Sarah and Michael was impossible to miss, and she could see her father's analytical mind already working to understand what was happening. They sat in the living room, and Sarah began to tell the story of the miraculous reunion on the beach. She spoke slowly and carefully, watching her parents' faces as the incredible tale unfolded. When she reached the part about the photograph and the recognition, her mother gasped and reached for her father's hand. Michael, who had been quietly respectful throughout Sarah's narrative, spoke for the first time when she finished. His voice was steady but emotional as he thanked Dr. and Professor Chen for giving Sarah the loving home and opportunities that he had always hoped she would find. He made it clear that he had no intention of disrupting the family, relationships that had shaped Sarah into the remarkable woman she had become. What followed was one of the most emotionally charged and beautiful conversations Sarah had ever witnessed. Her adoptive parents, rather than feeling threatened or defensive, embraced Michael with a generosity of spirit that reminded Sarah why she loved them so much. They wanted to hear about his life, his service, his years of searching for Sarah. They thanked him for never giving up, for carrying the love that had ultimately led him back to her. Professor Chen, who taught literature at the local university, said that their story reminded her of the greatest myths and legends, tales of separated siblings who find each other against impossible odds. Dr. Chen, ever the pragmatist, was more interested in the medical aspects of Michael's injuries and recovery, engaging him in detailed discussions about his treatment and rehabilitation. As the evening progressed, Sarah watched with amazement as her two families began to blend together naturally. Michael fit into the family dynamic as if he had always been there, and her parents treated him with the same affection and interest they would show any of their children. By the end of the night, Michael had been invited to stay in the guest room for as long as he needed. Over the following days, Sarah had the extraordinary experience of watching Michael discover what it meant to be part of a normal, loving family. He helped with household chores with military precision, engaged in long conversations with her father about history and politics, and charmed her mother with his genuine interest in her academic work. It was clear that he was storing up every moment, treasuring the experience of family life that he had been denied for so long. Sarah also introduced Michael to her close friends and colleagues, each meeting providing another opportunity to share their incredible story. Dr. Martinez, Sarah's mentor from medical school, was particularly moved by the reunion. She pointed out that Sarah's unconscious drive to become a healer might have been connected to her early loss, a way of processing trauma she couldn't consciously remember. One afternoon, while Sarah and Michael were walking through the park near her parents' house, he brought up a subject that had been weighing on his mind. He was scheduled to return to active duty in 6 weeks, and he was struggling with the decision of whether to continue his military career or retire and build a civilian life closer to Sarah and their new extended family. Michael had served 12 years in the military, with the option to retire after 20 years of service. The prospect of 8 more years away from Sarah, now that he had found her, seemed almost unbearable. But the military had been his life, his identity, his purpose for over a decade. The idea of leaving it behind was terrifying, even with the promise of family waiting for him. Sarah listened carefully to Michael's concerns, understanding that this was a decision only he could make. She shared her own recent thoughts about potentially relocating her practice to be closer to him, but she made it clear that he should make his choice based on what felt right for his own life and career, not on pressure to stay near her. That evening, the extended family gathered for dinner. Sarah, Michael, her adoptive parents, and several of her closest friends who had become like family over the years. Commander Morrison had also driven down from base to join them, bringing greetings from the rest of Michael's SEAL team. The commander's presence added a military formality to the gathering, but also provided Michael with a connection to the life and brotherhood he was considering leaving behind. During dinner, Commander Morrison shared stories about Michael's service record and the respect he had earned from his fellow SEALs. He spoke about upcoming missions and opportunities for advancement that awaited Michael if he chose to continue his military career. But he also acknowledged the unique circumstances of Michael's situation and assured him that whatever decision he made would have the full support of his military brothers. After dinner, Sarah found herself alone with Commander Morrison on the back porch, while Michael was inside showing her parents photos from his military service. The commander took the opportunity to share his own perspective on Michael's dilemma, speaking with the wisdom of someone who had spent decades balancing military duty with family obligations. Commander Morrison explained that the military had given Michael structure and purpose during the years when he had no family, but that purpose had always been incomplete. The real mission that had driven Michael throughout his service, finding his sister, had now been accomplished. The commander believed that Michael's next chapter, whatever it looked like, needed to honor both his military achievements and his newfound family connections. The conversation was interrupted by laughter from inside the house, where Michael was apparently sharing some humorous military stories with Sarah's family. The sound of his genuine happiness was something Commander Morrison said he had rarely heard in all their years of service together. It was clear that being surrounded by family was healing wounds in Michael that had nothing to do with his recent physical injuries. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Sarah realized that she was witnessing the formation of a new kind of family unit, one that honored her adoptive relationships while embracing the biological connection she had rediscovered. Michael wasn't replacing anyone in her life. He was adding a new dimension that made everything richer and more complete. 6 months after that fateful day on the beach, Sarah stood in the doorway of her new medical clinic, watching the autumn leaves drift past the windows of what had once been an empty storefront in a small town near the naval base where Michael was stationed. She had made the decision to relocate her practice, establishing a clinic that served both military families and the local civilian population that often struggled to access quality health care. The transition had been easier than she had expected, thanks in large part to the support network that had grown around her and Michael since their reunion. Several of Michael's SEAL teammates had helped with the physical renovation of the clinic space, working with the same precision and teamwork they brought to their military operations. The local community had welcomed her with open arms, grateful to have a physician with her credentials and humanitarian experience serving their area. Michael had ultimately decided to complete his military service, but with a new perspective on what that service meant. He had requested a transfer to a training position that would keep him stateside, allowing him to pass on his expertise to new generations of SEALs while remaining close to Sarah and their extended family. The decision had been met with understanding and support from his command, who recognized the exceptional circumstances of his situation. The changes in both siblings over the past months had been remarkable. Sarah had discovered a sense of purpose and belonging that went beyond her professional achievements. Having Michael in her life had given her access to a part of herself that she had never known existed, a connection to family history, shared genetics, and childhood memories that were gradually returning as they spent time together. Michael's transformation had been even more dramatic. The driven, somewhat solitary warrior who had spent 15 years searching for his lost sister had evolved into someone who understood that he was part of something larger than himself. The military brotherhood that had sustained him through dark times remained important, but it was now balanced by the civilian family connections that grounded him in a different way. On this particular afternoon, Sarah was expecting a special visitor. Commander Morrison had called to let her know that he was bringing a young SEAL who had recently lost his entire family in a car accident. The young man was struggling with grief and isolation, questioning whether he had anything left to fight for. The commander hoped that meeting Sarah and Michael, seeing their story of lost family found again, might provide some hope and perspective. When Commander Morrison arrived with the young SEAL, whose name was Petty Officer James Sullivan, Sarah immediately recognized the hollow look in his eyes. She had seen it in trauma patients who had lost everything, the expression of someone trying to figure out how to continue living when their reason for living had been taken away. She also saw something of Michael in the young man's bearing. the same protective instincts, the same need to serve something greater than himself. Michael joined them for coffee in Sarah's office, and without being asked, he began to share his own story of loss and searching. He spoke about the years when he had felt incomplete, when he had thrown himself into military service partly to avoid confronting the emptiness that loss had created in his life. He talked about carrying Sarah's photograph as a talisman, about the way hope had sustained him through the darkest missions. Petty Officer Sullivan listened with intense focus, occasionally asking questions about how Michael had maintained hope during the years when finding Sarah seemed impossible. Sarah watched the young man's expression gradually change as he absorbed the lesson that sometimes what seems lost forever can be found again in unexpected ways, and that family can be defined more broadly than just biological connections. The conversation evolved into a discussion about the different kinds of families that sustain people through difficult times. Michael spoke about his SEAL brothers, relationships forged in extreme circumstances that had provided stability and belonging when he had no blood relatives in his life. Sarah talked about her adoptive parents and how love could create family bonds just as strong as genetics. By the end of the visit, Petty Officer Sullivan seemed to have found something that had been missing since his tragedy. Commander Morrison later reported that the young man had returned to his duties with renewed focus and had begun reaching out to other members of his unit, building the kind of support network that could help him heal. That evening, Sarah and Michael attended a dinner party at her adoptive parents' house, another of the regular gatherings that had become a cherished tradition for their blended family. The guest list included several of Michael's SEAL teammates who had become close friends with Sarah's civilian family members, creating connections that bridged the military and civilian worlds. During dinner, Dr. Chen raised a toast to the first anniversary of Sarah's clinic. Noting how proud he was of the work she was doing and the lives she was touching in her new community, Professor Chen added her own toast to Michael's recent promotion and his decision to take on a training role that would allow him to shape the next generation of Special Operations Forces. Commander Morrison, who had become a regular guest at these family dinners, stood to offer his own toast. He spoke about witnessing the miracle on the beach 6 months earlier, about how it had reminded everyone present that hope and faith could triumph over seemingly impossible circumstances. He raised his glass to the power of family, both the families we're born into and the families we choose, and to the healing that comes from love and connection. As the evening wound down, Sarah found herself standing on the back porch with Michael, looking up at the same stars that had been shining the night they were separated as children. The silence between them was comfortable now, filled with the security of knowing that they would never lose each other again. Michael broke the silence by thanking Sarah for the sacrifices she had made to be near him, for leaving behind the international humanitarian work that had been so important to her. Sarah quickly corrected him, explaining that she hadn't sacrificed anything. She had simply discovered a different way to serve, one that allowed her to help people while staying connected to the family she had waited her whole life to find. They talked about their plans for the future, Michael's upcoming retirement from active duty in a few years, Sarah's hopes to expand her clinic to serve even more of the underserved population in their area, their shared dream of taking a trip to visit the place where they had lived as small children with their biological parents. As they prepared to go inside and rejoin the family gathering, Sarah realized that the story that had begun with tragedy and separation had evolved into something beautiful and redemptive. The brother who had never stopped searching had found the sister who hadn't known she was lost. The elite warriors who had dedicated their lives to protecting others had witnessed the power of love to heal the deepest wounds. The photograph that Michael had carried for 15 years now sat, framed on Sarah's desk at the clinic, but it was no longer a symbol of loss and longing. Instead, it had become a reminder of the unbreakable bonds that connect us to the people we love, and of the miracles that can happen when we refuse to give up hope, even in the darkest times.